It was a chilly evening in New York City, the kind where the cold creeps into your bones no matter how many layers you wear. The streets of Manhattan buzzed with life horns, blaring streetlights flickering and people rushing past, too caught up in their own world to notice much else. Keanu Reeves had just finished dinner at a quiet little diner on the Lower East Side, a place he liked because nobody bothered him there. He pulled his black beanie over his ears, adjusted the scarf around his neck, and stepped onto the sidewalk, blending into the crowd like any other New Yorker. As he walked past a small alley near an old bookstore, something made him stop, a faint voice low and tired. "Hey sir, could you spare a couple bucks for a coffee?" Keanu turned his head and saw a man sitting on a worn-out piece of cardboard huddled under a tattered coat. His hands were chapped from the cold, his face lined with exhaustion. He looked up hesitant, as if already expecting rejection. Keanu took a slow step. Closer, his eyes softened as he looked at the man. "You just want coffee?" Keanu asked, his voice calm and genuine. The man hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, just something warm, been a long day." Keanu tilted his head slightly. He'd seen this before. People struggling, getting ignored like they were invisible. It never sat right with him. He reached into his pocket, feeling for his wallet, but then an idea struck him. "Tell you what," Keanu said, tucking his wallet back into his coat. "How about we grab that coffee together, and maybe something to eat?" The man blinked clearly taken. "AB, you serious?" "Dead serious," Keanu replied with a small smile. "I could use a coffee myself." For a moment, the man just sat there processing what had just happened. He wasn't used to kindness from strangers, let alone someone offering to sit with him like an equal. Slowly, he pushed himself up, using the wall behind him for support. His hands trembled slightly, whether from the cold or just life wearing him down. "Keanu, wasn't sure you got a name?" Keanu asked as they started walking. "Michael," the man answered, stuffing his hands into his coat pockets, and, thanks, people usually just walk past." Keanu nodded. "Yeah, I know." They crossed the street and entered a small, cozy cafe, one of those old-school places with handwritten menus and the smell of fresh pastries hanging in the air. The bell above the door chimed as they stepped inside. A young barista glanced up from behind the counter. Her eyes widened slightly as she recognized Keanu. But to her credit, she kept her cool. "Hey there," she said, forcing herself not to stare too much. "What can I get you?" Keanu gestured toward Michael. "Whatever he wants, and I'll take a black coffee." Michael looked up at the menu, shifting awkwardly. He wasn't used to choosing. Usually he just took whatever scraps he could find. Just regular coffee's fine," he muttered. Keanu gave him a sideways glance. "Come on, get something real you eat today." Michael hesitated, then shook his head. Keanu turned back to the barista. "Throw in one of those breakfast sandwiches, 2 extra bacon." The barista nodded, jotting it down. "Got it. Anything else?" "That'll do," Keanu said, handing over his card. They took a seat by the window where the glow of street lights flickered against the glass outside. The city moved on, people rushing past, never stopping, never looking. Michael wrapped his hands around the warm cup, exhaling slowly as the heat seeped into his fingers. "This is different," he admitted after a long pause. "Most people don't even look at me, let alone sit down with me." Keanu sipped his coffee. "Most people are in too much of a hurry, or they just don't know what to say." Michael nodded. "Yeah, I get it ain't easy seeing someone like me." Keanu set his cup down. "So Michael, what's your story?" Michael exhaled sharply, like he hadn't been asked that in a long time. He stared down at his coffee fingers tapping against the cup. "You really want to know?" he asked, glancing up. Keanu met his gaze and nodded. "Yeah, I do." Michael hesitated, then leaned back in his chair. His eyes drifted toward the street outside like he was watching something far off in the past. "I wasn't always like this," he began, his voice quieter now. "Used to have a job in an apartment. I was a software engineer, actually. Good one, too." He let out a dry laugh. "Hard to believe now, huh?" Keanu didn't laugh, he just waited. Michael sighed. "Then one day company went under, layoffs hit. I thought I'd find another job quick, but weeks turned into months. Bills stacked up. Couldn't pay rent. Got evicted." He clenched his jaw, shaking his head slightly after that. "It was just one Thing after another, no address, no job, no job, no address. You fall through the cracks real fast. Keanu listened intently, his expression unreadable but his eyes full of understanding. Michael smirked bitterly. Crazy right 1 minute you're doing okay. The next you're just out here. Keanu leaned forward slightly. Yeah, I get it. Michael studied him for a moment. Do you though? Keanu took another sip of his coffee, more than you'd think. Michael frowned, curious now. What do you mean? Keanu tapped his fingers against the table, debating how much to say. But before he could answer, the barista returned, setting a plate down in front of Michael. Here you go, she said warmly. Michael looked at the sandwich. His stomach tightened, but not from hunger, more like hesitation. You don't got to do all this, man, he muttered. Keanu just shrugged. It's just food. Michael swallowed hard. His fingers hovered over the plate, then finally he picked up the sandwich and took a bite. His shoulders relaxed, and for the first time that night he let out a quiet sigh. Not from exhaustion, but relief. Keanu watched him for a moment, then glanced out the window. The city moved on as always, but for Michael, maybe, for the first time in a long time, things had stopped. SP spiraling downward. Michael chewed slowly, then looked up. Why are you doing this? Keanu's lips curved into a small smile. Because I can. Michael blinked. The weight of those 3 words hit harder than he expected, and at that moment something shifted. If you've ever witnessed or experienced an act of kindness that changed your perspective, drop a 1 in the comments. Let's talk about it. Michael took another bite of his sandwich, chewing slowly as if savoring something more than just the food. He hadn't had a warm meal like this in. He didn't even know how long that taste, the feeling of being indoors, of sitting across from someone who actually saw him. It was almost overwhelming across the table. Keanu sipped his coffee. Quiet, patient, he wasn't rushing Michael to speak. Wasn't pushing him for anything, just letting him be. Michael swallowed and set the sandwich down carefully, like he was afraid he'd wake up and it would be gone. You keep saying that, he murmured. Keanu raised an eyebrow. Saying what that you're doing? This because you can? Michael shook his head slightly. Most people can, they just don't. Keanu tilted his head, considering that. Maybe they don't know how. Michael let out a dry chuckle. Takes what, a couple bucks a cup of coffee? That's not rocket science. Keanu smiled faintly. Maybe not, but sometimes people get caught up in their own world. They forget. He tapped the side of his cup. Doesn't always mean they don't care. Michael exhaled, rubbing his hands together as the warmth from the coffee seeped into his fingers. Yeah. Maybe he paused, then glanced up. You ever been down bad, like really bad? Keanu leaned back slightly, eyes flickering with something, just for a moment before he masked it. I've had my days. Michael studied him, narrowing his eyes. Nah, see, that's an actor's answer. He smirked slightly. That was smooth, but it didn't actually tell me anything. Keanu huffed a quiet laugh. You're not wrong. He swirled the coffee in his cup, then set it down, fingers drumming against the ceramic. For a long moment he didn't speak. Michael almost thought he wouldn't. Then Keanu exhaled, failed, and met his eyes. I lost my best friend when I was 23. Michael's smirk faded. He didn't know what he'd been expecting, but it wasn't that car accident. Keanu continued, voice steady but quiet. One day he was there, the next he wasn't. He tapped his fingers against the cup again. Absently messed me up for a long time. Michael hesitated, unsure if he should say anything, but Keanu wasn't looking for pity. His expression was all calm, almost reflective. That's rough, man, Michael said eventually. Losing someone like that, don't think you ever really get over it. Keanu nodded slowly. No, you don't. His gaze flickered back to Michael. But you learn how to carry it. Michael ran, a hand through his hair. Guess that's the part I never figured out. Keanu leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the table. What was it for you? Michael hesitated, then sighed. My dad, cancer. He let out a humorous laugh. I was 16. He was gone before I even knew what was happening. 1 minute, he was this strong, unstoppable guy. Next minute, he shook his head. Just gone. Keanu nodded, his eyes soft with understanding. Michael exhaled, glancing toward the window. After that it was just me and my mom. She worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat. I did what I could, but he shrugged. Life catches up with you. Bills, responsibilities, one wrong turn, and suddenly everything you worked for gone. Keanu was quiet for a moment, then said, "You tried to reach out to her." Michael shook his head. "She passed 5 years ago, stroke." He let out another breath slower. "This time after that, I just stopped trying." Keanu studied him for a long moment. Stop trying. Or stop believing anyone would care. Michael flinched slightly at that. He looked down at his hands, fingers curling around the cup. He didn't answer. Keanu didn't push. He just sat there, letting the silence settle between them after a long pause. Michael sighed. "You ever get tired, man?" Keanu tilted his head of what Michael gestured vaguely of people of life. Just all of it. Keanu was quiet for a long moment. Then finally he said, "Yeah." Michael let out a breath. "Yeah." He rubbed his face. "You ever wonder why you even bother?" Keanu nodded. "I do." Michael looked at him, waiting for more, but Keanu didn't elaborate. Michael sighed. "So what keeps you going?" Keanu tapped his fingers against the table, again thinking. Then he gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug. "Moments like this." Michael blinked. "Like this?" He gestured between them. "You mean sitting in some random cafe talking to some washed-up guy off the street?" Keanu smiled. "Yeah." Michael scoffed. "Why?" Keanu leaned back. "Because it's real." Michael frowned slightly, as if he wasn't sure how to take that. Keanu continued, "When you strip away all the noise, all the expectations, all the distractions, this is what's left. Just people, just conversations." He took another sip of coffee. "I like that." Michael was quiet for a long time. He didn't know what to say to that. Eventually, he just let out a slow breath. "You're weird, man." Keanu laughed. "Yeah." Michael smirked slightly, but like in a good way. Keanu raised his cup in mock toast. "I'll take it." Michael shook his head, but the smirk didn't fade for the first time. In a long time, he didn't feel completely invisible. The cafe was quieter now. The rush of evening, customers dying down outside the city, still moved, the neon lights casting long shadows on the pavement. Michael exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "So what happens now?" Keanu tilted his head. "What do you mean?" Michael gestured vaguely. "I mean, this, you bought me food, we talked, what's next? You going to drop me back off at my corner with a pat on the back?" Keanu studied him. For a moment, then he shook his head. "Nah." Michael raised an eyebrow. "No." Keanu smirked slightly. "You need a shower first." Michael blinked, then let out a surprised laugh. "Damn, all right. That's fair." Keanu chuckled, tossing a few bills onto the table for the tip. "Come on, I know a place." Michael hesitated for just a second. Then slowly he pushed himself up from his seat. For the first time in years, he felt like maybe he wasn't completely alone. The cold night air hit Michael as he stepped outside the cafe, but for the first time in years, it didn't feel quite as harsh. Maybe it was the full stomach. Maybe it was the conversation, or maybe it was the simple fact that for once he wasn't walking away from a place alone. Keanu adjusted his scarf and motioned for Michael to follow. "Is not far," he said. Nodding toward the next block, Michael fell in step beside him. "So, where exactly are we going?" "A hotel." Keanu replied. "Nothing fancy, but it's clean. And they won't ask questions." Michael snorted. "Sounds like my kind of place." He shoved his hands into his coat pockets. "Man, you really don't have to do all this." Keanu glanced over. "I know that was it. No long explanation, no speech, just those 2 words, simple and matter of fact." Michael shook his head with a quiet chuckle. "You ever do something normal, like just go home and watch TV?" Keanu smirked. Sometimes they walked in comfortable silence for a few minutes, passing storefronts closing for the night. The city still had life, but it was different. Now slower, quieter. The neon signs flickered, taxis sped by. Steam curled from the grate in the sidewalk. Eventually, they reached a small boutique hotel, a place that had probably been nice back in the 90s, but now had the look of something just trying to stay in business. Keanu held the door open, and Michael hesitated for just a second before stepping inside. The lobby smelled faintly of coffee and old carpet. Their receptionist, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, barely looked up from her computer. Keanu walked to the counter. "Hey," he said, his voice warm but casual. "You got a room for a couple nights?" The woman finally glanced up. Her eyes flickered to Michael, taking in the worn-out coat, the rough edges. Michael braced himself for the usual response. A hesitant frown, a polite excuse, a quiet refusal. But Keanu had already pulled out, his wallet sliding his credit card onto the counter like it was just another business transaction. The woman hesitated. Then, without another word, she nodded and typed something into the computer. Single room. Keanu nodded. Yeah, just needs a bed and shower. Michael glanced sideways, not a sight, no personal butler. Keanu chuckled. You want a butler? Michael snorted. Nah, I'd probably just piss him off. The receptionist handed over a key card. Third floor end of the hall, she said, sliding it across the counter. Keanu picked it up and turned to Michael. All yours. Michael took the card, but didn't move right away. He just stood there staring at it. Something wrong? Keanu asked. Michael exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. It's been a long time since I had a door that locked from the inside. Keanu's face didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Understanding, Michael forced a smirk. I mean, I'm assuming there's no rat infestation, right? That's kind of a deal breaker, Keanu shrugged. Guess you'll find out. Michael chuckled and finally started toward the elevator. But before he stepped inside, he paused and looked back. Hey, he said, tilting his head. Why are you doing all this? Really? Keanu leaned against the counter, hands in his pockets. What do? You think? Michael studied him for a moment, as if trying to read something beneath the surface. I don't know. He admitted that's what's weird about it. Keanu just gave a small smile. Good night, Michael. Michael held his gaze for a beat longer, then finally he nodded. Yeah, good night. The elevator doors slid shut and Keanu stood there for a moment, watching the floor numbers tick upward. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out into the night. Michael stood under the hot shower, letting the water beat against his skin. At first he didn't move, just stood there, letting the grime, the exhaustion, the weight of the past few years slowly wash down the drain. It had been so long since he'd had this, something as simple as a locked door, warm water, clean towels. When he finally stepped out, he caught sight of himself in the mirror. And for the first time in years, he saw someone he almost recognized. The scruff was gone. His skin looked cleaner, his eyes less hollow. He ran a hand through his damp hair, exhaling slowly. Maybe this was just a couple of nights in a hotel. Maybe it wouldn't change anything, but damn if it didn't feel different. For the first time in a long time, something felt possible. Michael woke up in an actual bed that alone was strange. No cold pavement, no stiff cardboard, just blankets, warmth, silence. He lay there for a minute, staring at the ceiling. Then slowly he swung his legs over the side and rubbed his face. There was a knock at the door. Michael tented in instinctively. Before realizing, right, hotel door. He had a room. He stood and opened it. Keanu stood there holding 2 coffee cups. Morning, he said, handing one over. Michael blinked, taking it. Automatically. You some kind of guardian angel or what? Keanu smirked. No, truly. Michael took a sip. Black coffee. No sugar. He nodded approvingly. All right, I'll give you this. You got good taste. Keanu chuckled. Figure I'd check in. Michael leaned against the doorframe. You really don't have to keep doing this. Keanu nodded. I know. Michael sighed, running a hand through his hair. All right, so what's the deal? Keanu raised an eyebrow. What deal? You clearly got some kind of master plan. Michael said, what is it? Get me a job. Enroll me in college. Buy me a yacht. Keanu smiled. I don't think you need a yacht, Michael snorted. Yes, well, would have been nice. Keanu took a sip of his own coffee. I do know a guy looking for someone to help out at a shop. Nothing fancy, just stockroom work, deliveries. Pays enough for a small place if you save up. Michael stared at him. Keanu met his gaze, calm, steady. Up to you, he added. Michael exhaled, looking down at the coffee in his hands. He thought about all the times people had promised him something, help, a fresh start, only to take it back, or disappear, or expect something in return. But Keanu didn't seem like the type to ask for anything. He just seemed real. Michael sighed. You're persistent. I'll give you that. Keanu shrugged it. Try. Michael was quiet for a long time. Then finally he nodded. All right, let's see where this goes. Keanu smiled. Good choice, Michael huffed. We'll see, but for the first time in years, he actually meant it. Michael took another sip of his coffee, still standing in the doorway of his hotel room, the heat from the cup seeped into his fingers, grounding him. He glanced at Keanu, who leaned casually against the doorframe, completely unbothered by the situation. Michael let out a slow breath. All right, let's say I take this job. Keanu lifted an eyebrow. Yeah, Michael shifted his weight. What's the catch? Keanu smirked. There's no catch. Michael narrowed his eyes. No offense, man, but that's kind of hard to believe. People don't just do this. Keanu nodded slightly, as if he understood exactly why Michael was skeptical. You're right, most people don't. He took a slow sip of his coffee, then added, but maybe they should. Michael scoffed, shaking his head. You really believe that? Keanu met his gaze steady and unwavering. Yeah, I do. Michael exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. He didn't know what to say to that. After a moment, Keanu pushed off the door frame. Think about it. Finish your coffee shower if you want. I'll be downstairs. Michael blinked downstairs. Keanu shrugged. Figured I'd wait. No pressure, though. Michael hesitated, glancing back into his room. The bed slept in, but still warm. The bathroom clean, stocked with towels that weren't stolen from a shelter. The mirror showing a version of himself he hadn't seen in years. He turned back to Keanu. Give me 15 minutes, Keanu smiled. Take your time. Michael wasn't sure what felt weirder, walking through the hotel lobby looking like a normal person, or the fact that nobody gave him a second glance. Keanu was waiting outside, hands in his coat, pockets watching the city wake up. Michael adjusted the sleeves of his jacket. It still felt foreign, wearing something that actually fit all right. Right, he said, stopping next to Keanu. Let's do this. Keanu nodded and started walking. Michael followed, stuffing his hands in his pockets. So what kind of shop is this? Hardware. Keanu said family-owned, guy's been running it for years, but he's short on help. Michael huffed. I don't know anything about toolsmen. Keanu shrugged. You'll learn. Michael smirked. You always this optimistic? Keanu smirked back. Nah, just about the things that matter. They walked in silence for a few blocks. The city had shifted from its late-night chaos into morning routine. Coffee carts on corners, office workers rushing past, yellow taxis weaving through traffic. Eventually, Keanu stopped in front of a small, old-fashioned hardware store. The sign above the door was faded, but the windows were clean, and a handwritten "Help Wanted" sign was taped to the glass. Michael stared at it. Guess you weren't kidding. Keanu opened the door. Come on. The bell above the door jingled as they stepped inside. The smell of sawdust and metal filled the air, along with the distant sound of a radio playing classic rock. Behind the counter stood a man in his late 50s wearing a well-worn flannel and reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. He looked up as they entered, his expression neutral at first, then mildly surprised when he recognized Keanu. Well, I'll be damned, the man said, setting down a notepad. Didn't think I'd see you again so soon. Keanu smiled. Morning, Joe. Joe pulled off his glasses, looking between Keanu and Michael. What's the deal? Keanu gestured toward Michael. Got you some help. Joe studied Michael, eyes sharp. But not in kind. You ever worked in a hardware store? Michael shook his head. Nope. Joe grunted. Ever fixed anything? Michael smirked. My life's been held together with duct tape and prayer for the last few years. That count? Joe huffed a laugh. You got a smart mouth, I'll give you that. Michael shrugged. It's all I got. Joe considered him for a moment. Then he leaned forward on the counter. Look, kid, I'm not a charity. This ain't just some feel-good gig. You show up late, you slack off, you're gone. Got it? Michael straightened. Slightly, yeah, I got it. Joe studied him a bat longer, then nodded. All right, you start tomorrow, 7 A. Buri, you're sharp. Michael blinked. That's it, Joe smirked. What you want? Paperwork? I'll deal with that later. Just don't make me regret it. Michael exhaled, nodding. All right, I'll be here. Joe gave Keanu a look. You vouching for him? Keanu nodded. Yeah, I am. Joe grunted. Then I hope you're right. He turned and walked toward the back room. Michael exhaled, still standing. They're processing what had just happened. Keanu nudged his shoulder. Told you. Michael shook his head. You really don't give up, do you? Keanu smiled. Not when it's important. Michael let out a slow breath. 700 A. Emma, he muttered, mostly to himself. Guess I better set an alarm. Keanu clapped him on the back. Guess so. For the first time in years, Michael had a reason to wake up early, and damn, if that didn't feel strange. They stepped back outside the morning sun, Warmer now, Michael stood on the sidewalk, hands in his pockets, looking at nothing in particular. Keanu watched him for a moment. "You all right?" Michael huffed a quiet laugh. "I don't know, man, this is just a lot." Keanu nodded. "Yeah, it is." Michael ran a hand through his hair. "What if I screw it up?" Keanu tilted his head. "Then you fix it," Michael scoffed. "That easy, huh?" Keanu smirked. "Not easy, but possible." Michael stared at the pavement. "Yeah, I guess that's a start." Keanu clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Leet and get some breakfast." Michael blinked at him. "We just had coffee." Keanu shrugged. "Coffee isn't food." Michael snorted. "Tell that to every broke college student in the country." Keanu grinned. "Come on, Michael." Hesitated for just a second. Then finally he followed because, for the first time, in a long time, he actually had somewhere to go. The next morning, Michael stood in front of the mirror in his hotel room, staring at himself. He looked normal. The new clothes Keanu had gotten him weren't fancy, just a plain t-shirt and a pair of jeans, but they fit. His hair was still little uneven, but it was clean. His face, he barely recognized it without the layer of exhaustion and street grime he exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. 7A. Monsieur Sharp Joe had made that clear, and for the first time in years, Michael actually had a reason to be somewhere. That thought alone was terrifying. He grabbed the room key, shoved it in his pocket, and headed out. Keanu was waiting outside, leaning against black motorcycle. Michael frowned as he walked up. "Seriously, a bike?" Keanu smirked. "Faster than walking." Michael shook his head, eyeing the machine. "Yeah, no offense, man, but I seen what happens when people try to look cool on these things. It usually ends in a hospital bill." Keanu laughed. "Good thing I know what I'm doing." Michael eyed him skeptically. "You sure about that?" Keanu handed him a helmet. "Only one way to find out, Michael." Sigh, taking it. "If ID, I'm haunting you." Keanu grinned, noted the hardware. Store wasn't much different from how it had looked yesterday. Same faded sign, same cluttered shelves, same air of dust and history. But today, Michael wasn't just passing through. Today, he was supposed to work here. That still felt weird. Joe was behind the counter when they walked in, adjusting a display of measuring tapes. He looked up, giving Michael a quick once-over. "All right," he grunted. "At least you look like you belong here." Michael smirked. That's supposed to be a compliment. Joe didn't answer. He just tossed a small notepad onto the counter. "First rule, everything in this store has a place. You move something, you put it back. Second rule, customers don't like feeling stupid. You don't know something, don't guess. Ask." Michael nodded. "Got it." Joe narrowed his eyes. "Third rule, you're late, you're gone." Michael exhaled. "I'm here, aren't I?" Joe grunted barely. He turned to Keanu. "You sticking around to babysit?" Keanu smirked. "Nah, he's got this." Michael shot him a look. Great vote of confidence. Keanu just clapped him on the shoulder. "I'll check in later with that." He walked out, leaving Michael standing there, feeling like a kid dropped off at his first day of school. Joe sighed, rubbing his forehead. "All right, let's see if you're actually useful, Michael." Smirk. Challenge accepted. For the first hours, Michael shadowed Joe, watching him interact with customers. It wasn't what he'd expected. People didn't just walk and grab what they needed and leave. Most of them had questions. Some simple, some completely ridiculous. One guy spent 15 minutes trying to decide between two different brands of screws. Another swore that a wrench was too heavy and wanted to know if they had a lighter version. Michael struggled not to laugh. "Is this normal?" He muttered to Joe. Joe grunted. "People don't always know what they need. That's why we're here." Michael nodded, taking mental notes. By noon, Joe had him stock shelves. It wasn't hard, just tedious. But as Michael stacked boxes of nails and rearranged rows of screwdrivers, something strange happened. People started talking to him. An older woman asked for help finding a specific kind of light bulb. A young couple wanted to know the difference between two brands of paint. And for the first time in a long time, Michael found himself part of something, not just another face on the street. Not just someone to be ignored. People saw him, spoke to him, needed him. It felt weird, but in a good way. By the time Keanu showed up that afternoon, Michael was exhausted. He had no idea working in a store could be this physically draining. His feet hurt, his back ached. His brain felt fried from explaining the difference between metric and imperial measurements to three different people. But when he saw Keanu standing by the counter, arms crossed, smirking slightly, he didn't complain. Joe, standing beside him, grunted. "He's not completely useless." Michael snorted. "That's high praise coming from you," Joe smirked. "Don't get cocky." Keanu raised an eyebrow. "So you sticking with it, Michael?" Hesitated for just a second, then he nodded. "Yeah," he said, "I think I am." Joe grunted again, which Michael was starting to realize was just his version of approval. Keanu clapped him on the back. "Good, you earned it," Michael exhaled, glancing at around the store. It was just a job stocking shelves, answering questions, sweeping floors. But to him it was more than that. It was a start, and for now that was enough. That night Michael lay on the hotel bed staring at the ceiling. His body ached in ways he hadn't felt in years. Not from sleeping on pavement, not from running from the cold, but from working. He felt it. The exhaustion, the soreness, but also the satisfaction. He turned his head slightly, looking at the neatly folded receipt on the bedside table. His first paycheck would come in a week. That was something real. He exhaled slowly, closing his eyes for the first time in a long time. He wasn't just surviving, he was moving forward. Michael sat on the edge of the hotel bed, staring at his reflection in the mirror. The past few days had been a whirlwind, getting the job, working real hours, feeling like a person again. But now, in the quiet of the night, doubt started to creep in. He'd been here before, almost a chance, a glimmer of hope, only for it to slip through his fingers. What if this was the same? What if he screwed it up? What if Joe got tired of him? What if Keanu realized he wasn't worth the trouble? He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. It's different this time, or at least it could be a knock at the door. Pulled him from his thoughts. He stood up, stretched his aching back, and opened it. Keanu stood there holding 2 paper bags. Michael raised an eyebrow. "Let me guess, food?" Keanu smirked. "Breakfast. Thought you might want something before work." Michael stepped aside, letting him in. "You really enjoy feeding people, huh?" Keanu shrugged, setting the bags down on the small table. "I like good food, and I hate seeing people go hungry." Michael sat across from him, pulling out a breakfast sandwich. "Well, guess I can't argue with that." They ate in silence for a moment, the city humming outside. Then Keanu spoke. "So how's it going?" Michael chewed slowly, thinking he could say fine, could brush it off like he always did. But this was Keanu, and for some reason he didn't want to lie. He swallowed and set the sandwich down. It got weird. Keanu tilted his head. Weird. How Michael ran a hand through his hair, having a job, waking up at a normal time, talking to people who don't look at me like I'm nothing. He exhaled. "I spent so long just surviving, and now I don't know." Keanu studied him for a moment. "You don't trust it yet?" Michael huffed. A laugh. "Bingo." Keanu leaned back, sipping his coffee. "That's normal." Michael eyed him. "Yeah." Keanu nodded. "Change doesn't feel real at first. Feels temporary. Like it's just a matter of time before things fall apart again." He set his cup down. "But that's the trick, Michael. You don't let it." Michael was quiet, absorbing that. Keanu continued. "Look, I can help you. Joe can give you a job. But at the end of the day, this is on you. No one can make you believe in yourself. You have to choose that." Michael stared at the table, his fingers tapping lightly against the edge. Then finally he nodded. "Yeah, I get that." Keanu smirked. "Good, because Joe's not the patient type." Michael snorted. "Yeah, I picked up on that." Keanu stood up, tossing his empty coffee cup in the trash. "Come on, you don't want to be late." Michael grabbed his jacket, rolling his shoulders. Yeah, I'm coming." They stepped outside, the morning air crisp against their skin. Michael took a deep breath, then followed Keanu down the street for the first time. In years, he wasn't just walking. He was moving forward. The day went by fast. Michael was getting the hang of things, restocking, helping customers, figuring out where everything belonged. Joe wasn't the easiest guy to work for, but he was fair by the time the store closed. Michael was exhausted, but it was good kind of exhaustion, the kind that came from earning something. As he wiped down the counter, Joe walked up, arms crossed. "You didn't screw up too bad today," Joe grunted. Michael smirked. "High praise." Joe exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "Be here tomorrow. Same time." Michael wiped his hands on a rag. "You got it?" Joe studied him for a second, then nodded and walked out. Michael stood there looking around the empty store, This was real. This was happening, and maybe he could do this. That night, he and Keane sat outside the hotel watching the city lights. Michael leaned back, stretching his legs out. "You know, I don't think I ever thanked you properly." Keanu raised an eyebrow for what Michael gestured vaguely. "All of it, the food, the hotel, the job, you didn't have to do any of that." Keanu nodded. "I know." Michael smirked. "You and your simple answers." Keanu chuckled. "You're welcome, Misha." Michael, they sat in comfortable silence for a while, then Keanu spoke. "You know what you have to do now, right?" Michael glanced over what Keanu looked at him, his expression calm, but serious. "When you're back on your feet, when you're steady, you help someone else, you pass it on." Michael stared at him, then slowly he nodded. "Yeah," he murmured. "I will, Keanu." Smiled. Good. They sit there, watching the city move around them, a world that had once left Michael behind. But not anymore, because now he was part of it again.